Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. We're just about to get started, but we'll just give folks another minute or so to get logged in and to get set up, and then we'll get going. Hi, everybody. We're just going to wait for another minute or so just to let folks get logged in and get set up, and then we'll dive right into the presentation. Okay, I'm going to just start with some opening remarks here. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to ARMA's EPR webinar series. This is the third and final session of our workshop series in partnership with Dillon Consulting. My name is Kayla Duty, and I'm a communications manager with Canadian Strategy Group. It's my pleasure to serve as facilitator and moderator for the workshop today. And before we get going, I would like to start us off with a land acknowledgement. ARMA works with Albertans from all areas of our province and acknowledges the Indigenous peoples who lived among and traveled the land in the area currently known as Alberta. The relationship that peoples of Treaty 4, 6, 7, 8, and 10, Alberta's Métis, and the Inuit people have with the land is founded on a deep respect for the environment. This connection forms the foundation of our responsibility and vision of inspiring a future without waste. Today's webinar is the final one of a three-part workshop series to help prepare communities for changes to their waste management system following the transition to EPR. This workshop today will show you how to develop a mock transition plan and help you develop a timeline and key accountabilities. Following this final workshop, communities will understand how to develop a transition plan with associated timelines, roles, and responsibilities. So to keep the time moving along nicely today, we plan to follow prior webinar settings where registrant audio functionality has been turned off unless requested by you. So that means to ask questions, we invite you to either use the Q&A chat or the raise your hand function. Dillon Consulting will be opening the floor to questions after each section in their presentation, and we'll be addressing them all then. A reminder as well that these webinar sessions are being recorded, and they will be made available on the ARMA website afterwards. So with that being said, I will now turn it over to ARMA EPR Executive Director, Gabby Betts. Over to you, Gabby.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Kayla, and welcome everyone to the third of our 3 workshop series on community EPR transition planning. The objective for the workshop today is to use the information that we've gathered in the EPR transition planning tool to develop a transition plan that's unique for your community. This will really help you to identify planning activities, assign roles and responsibilities, as well as identify milestones and implementation planning for transition-related activities. Dillon Consulting is providing today's webinar, and the primary presenters will be Beth Goodger, Kathy Radden, and they will be supported by Sydney Baker and Charlotte Banks. Thank you again for participating. As you know, supporting Alberta's communities is a top priority for ARMA. If there's ever any questions that you have or any suggestions that you may have, please reach out directly to the ARMA EPR team at any time. We're always happy to arrange a meeting with you and answer all of your questions. In addition, if there's anything that would be helpful on our website, please also let us know. And with that, I'll pass it over to our presenters.
Great, thanks, Gabby. Welcome to workshop number 3. I wanted to do a bit of a recap first before we start diving into the transition plan. So we started in workshop 1 talking about the current state of your community and your community's waste management system and what you'd need to know in advance of using the EPR transition tool. And then in workshop 2, we started going through the EPR tool itself using an example community called the City of Frostview. And this helped you identify some details on what stop, starts, changes, and continues when planning for scenarios and help you move forward in developing this plan. Next slide, please. I just wanted to reference the ARMA website. that has the resources and the presentations that were made in workshops 1 and 2. And so you've got those recordings to refer back to. Important thing was having the EPR transition tool template itself, as well as the sample community that was completed, the sample EPR transition tool that was completed for FrostView. So we'll be referencing that again today. In terms of how we use the tool, next slide, we followed, we're using change management principles in using the transition tool and developing the transition plan. And a change of this magnitude requires a focused effort to look at all the ripple effects of that change on your integrated waste management system. And it goes beyond your basic project planning to look at the impacts on the people involved in your community's waste management system, as well as the business processes. The tool also was used to help you identify risks, mitigation strategies for those risks, benefits to your system of this EPR transition, and also identifying the transition activities and related costs. So the core work is really now using this information to develop a transition plan. And it's going to be used to describe those expected changes and examine the future state options that you have. It will be also used to develop the transition activities, communication tools, and looking at roles and responsibilities, and all the timing requirements, which is going to be the subject of today's workshop. And we'll be getting into a lot more details on that. Before we get into the details of the transition plan itself, I just wanted to pause quickly to see if there were any questions about completing the EPR transition tool template, and if you had any concerns or comments about that. I know we did receive some questions about the tool itself, and just want to remind you that this is a fictitious city that we modeled and used it to develop some potential scenarios, and these are there are many options. So any quick questions before we dive in? There'll be more opportunities for questions, so I think we'll just move on and dive right into the details then. So the first thing that we always do in developing these transition plans is develop a table of contents. This kind of gives you a guide that you're going to be using to figure out how you're filling in the information and using the information that you're developing from the tool itself. So this is a sample table of contents. The first part is the executive summary and the key takeaways. And this is really going to be high level information, probably stuff that you're going to use for your community council and what I like to call the elevator pitch. So you can quickly describe what's happening with the changes and what you're looking at in the plan. Section 1 of the table of contents gives the background context on the regulation and the overview of your community's waste management system. And section 2 is delving into the future state. So talking about your analysis of the preferred scenario based on benefits and costs that you'll be analyzing. Section 3 gets into the transition activities and specific things that you're going to be doing to get from current state to this new system. And it's based on that analysis of risks and mitigation strategies, includes things like your comms plans and the roles and responsibilities. And really important is the transition timeline. So that will have the milestones, and really this is your overall project plan that will be used so that you have a roadmap and timelines to follow. And then, of course, a closing section of the next steps. So we'll be running through what all the details in this in today's workshop on what you're looking for in these various sections. Before we do that, I want to talk a little bit about council updates and approvals. And this is throughout the process, you're going to need to inform your community council about what's happening with this new change in responsibilities and get approval from your council at various points. So this needs to be factored in all elements of the transition plan. So we wanted to talk about this up front, and things like getting their approval on which future state you're going to implement, getting advanced approvals on who's going to be able to negotiate with the pros. This is something different for you. And changes, any major changes that will require council approvals, such as staffing, contracts, budgets, all of that kind of stuff. So these will need to be considered at various points as you're developing your transition plan. And I really would encourage more frequent updates. This is, we've seen with the communities that we've worked with that that they do often frequent updates to their councils, sometimes just as information items to let them know what's coming before the big decisions are and help them understand the depth of this change in community responsibility to producers. So now I'm going to walk you through sections 1 and 2 of the transition plan, and then I'll be handing things over to Kathy to talk about the detailed transition plan itself. So section 1 is the easy part, the context and current state. And really what you're doing is providing that community overview. And this is what our sample community of Frostview that we used at the last workshop. And next slide. And the current state for Frostview is provided here on this slide. I won't go into those details, but keep this in mind, is that this is our starting point and helping us figure out what all of those transition steps are going to need to be in selecting the future state. The next part of the transition plan is the future state. And if you recall from last time, our sample community had 3 potential scenarios. Next slide, please. And these were documented in the overview tab of the EPR transition tool. So we had scenario 1 of no EPR services provided by Frostview. The second scenario was that Frostview was going to be an EPR service provider to the pros. And the third scenario is that Frostview was going to be a depot EPR service provider. Next slide, please. So in terms of determining the future state, before getting into being able to identify specific activities to transition to a future state, there's going to be a bit of a process on determining that future state. And this phase looks at knowledge gathering and change management activities that help you evaluate the potential options that your community has and make the recommendations on what that future is going to look like. So considerations include the financial analysis of the options. It will include negotiations with the pros on what those terms are going to be for agreements, assessing the risks and benefits of the various options that you have, and confirmation of assumptions that you made. If you recall, in the EPR tool, there is a section there that you're thinking, these are the things I think are going to happen, but there needs to be a confirmation that those are going to happen and validation of that. And I'll talk a bit about that in a few slides coming up. So a really important part is going to be the financial analysis of the various options that you're considering. And you'll need to do this in advance to help you understand your costs so that you know what you're negotiating with in terms when you're negotiating with the pros, and being able to validate that those costs will cover some or all of your costs. understanding what the business units are and how they're going to be impacted in terms of budget processes. So moving forward, your budget lines are going to look a lot different when there's no longer responsibility for those EPR materials, and ultimately updating those capital budget forecasts and operating forecasts, and also requesting funds for transition. That you'll see that there are likely some one-time activities that you've identified that are going to need some sort of funding. The transition tool itself is used to help identify those qualitative changes in your budget process, and can be used side by side with your budget and diving into and identifying those specific general ledger account numbers that are going to be affected in the change. So this will be a significant part of your transition plan, to go through this financial analysis of the options, and probably will involve some iterations as new information and costing information comes comes through as part of the planning process. Next slide, please. One of the parts of the financial analysis is going to be the potential service agreements with the pros, and negotiating is a very different activity for communities. This is likely not something that you've typically done within local governments. The process usually is a tender or request for proposals, and very formal process. So this is going to be a unique undertaking, and you're likely going to need to get that council approval that I mentioned earlier to be able to go forward and discuss terms and conditions. Probably want to get some negotiating parameters so that councils understand what you're going to be negotiating. And there will be a process of getting those offers and contracts from the producer responsibility organizations, reviewing those contract terms, evaluating that, and making sure that there are not any undue risks to your community, and that they can be fulfilled in those obligations as a provider to the pro. And ultimately, there would be a process to get your council approval of that agreement. And this will really give that final costing and understanding for your financial analysis on the previous slide. So what I'm going to do now is talk a little bit about this process using our sample community of Frostview. And the Frostview has selected scenario 2. And so this means that they're going to be a service provider for the EPR materials, and they're going to enter into that contract with a pro, and they're maintaining their contracts. And all of the information on this slide is the description from the EPR tool overview that you saw and were able to reference from last time. So I'm going to talk a bit about the assumptions that we used in the last workshop on the next slide. And this is all from the tool itself and what they were assuming was going to happen. So I wanted to draw attention to some things like the full compensation from the pro. So our Frostview has validated that they can meet the pro requirements, and they were assuming at the time that all of their costs were going to be covered. And this was really an important starting point because of the EPR model that producers are responsibility for those costs. Frostview had to assume that all of their costs would be covered in the agreement that they negotiated. So Frostview went through a process to validate these assumptions, and I'm going to now talk about some of their outcomes as a result of this financial analysis and the pre-work in selecting the future state option. So for Frostview, they completed their financial analysis and they understood all of their costs for those various options that they were considering. They ended up determining that there would be some additional cost to them for tracking their customers and meeting the pro agreement requirements, but their analysis showed them that their costs overall are going to be much lower than setting up the separate collection systems for those ineligible customers. They were able to negotiate that agreement with the pros and align the term of the pro agreement with the end of their contract with their current providers to November 2027. And they were also able to negotiate that the carts would be provided by the pros and distributed by the city. So that was helpful in their capital budgets. And they also are going to be getting some compensation for the promotion and education of the EPR services. And again, these are fictitious things that happened to Frostview, and this is here to illustrate how you'll be going through that process to figure out what your future state option is for your community. The second part of the community outcomes, next slide, is that they found that there were going to be savings from the EPR transition, and they decided that because they were contemplating organics collection, that this would be a great opportunity to redirect those savings into the launch of an organics program in 2026. And they're going to be able to cover with some of their savings, some of the one-time from the one-time transition savings in the transition year of 2025 to implement that organics program. So an example of how to redirect those funds from EPR savings into things in your waste management system that you were wanting to do previously but couldn't afford before. They have, if you recall, our Frostview community has a rate-based system, and in order to illustrate the change for the ratepayers, Frostview decided that they were still going to collect those revenues from the recycling program. It's going to be a part-year transition, that they would instead give a rebate to residents to illustrate that producers are now paying for that program, but they're going to be introducing the organics program and introducing a rate for that. So essentially, there's probably not going to be any change for their customers, and that would be the way that they're introducing the change and redirecting those funds. They're going to continue on with all of their P&E, and they got the program council approval for that agreement with their pro agreement once the negotiations were completed. So this is an illustration of how you go through this process of looking at the options, making those assumptions, and validating those assumptions as you're going through the details. And this is really the first component of your overall transition plan, and key aspects to figure out the timing for that. What I'm going to do now is hand things over to my colleague, Kathy, to walk you through how to implement the specific activities to implement that future state for Frostview. There's also going to be an illustration of some of the other options so that you can see how you might use the specific details in transition planning to implement various options that you might be considering. Over to Kathy.
Thanks, Beth. So based on what Beth has provided already, I'll go into some more detail around the specific activities that will then form part of this transition plan. And as mentioned, it's important to gather the information through the transition planning tool, and that information that's been noted in there will determine your scenario and your option, and then what activities go forward. Can we advance, please? So just a summary of the activities for our example of Frostview. We can categorize these activities in different ways, but here we've said internal planning and communications. It's sort of a cluster of things that we've seen as mitigation activities that are listed in the tool. So this is based on step 4 of the tool. And it's again, it's the understanding of the future state and the risks and mitigations from the scenario that's been selected. So you can refer to that and then come up with your list. For internal planning and communications, there's developing an internal transition team to coordinate business plan updates, developing a transition plan schedule, internal communications planning, a bylaw update and enforcement plan, update performance measures, and reprogram software to remove the EPR materials from the system that's used at the scale house. We also have activities that are related to external communications. So that would include things like staff training on external communications. So for example, if there's customer service staff that have a script, that script needs to change to be in accordance with what the services will look like. Updates to program information that would be communicated to the public, and any other promotion and education materials would have to be reviewed as well. For FrostView as well, we would pull out some actions, activities related to contracts and financial planning. So a financial analysis of costs and benefits, this would be done early, as Beth was discussing earlier. Preparation for discussions with the pro and negotiating the pro to cover the cost of facilities and equipment. Discussion with the pro on changes to depot operations, and negotiation with the contractor on existing collection contract. So all of those things will need to be thought through. And this is just an initial step, as I mentioned, of pulling out from that step 4 of the transition plan tool. And I think we'll pause for some questions that may have come in from this material so far.
Great, thank you, Kathy. So as we have said before, you are welcome to provide your questions in the Q&A chat function. You also can raise your hand and we'll unmute you if you'd like to ask a verbal question that we'll answer. I do see a couple of questions that have come through. So one was just clarifying the theme of today's presentation, and the theme is just to talk about the transition plan development. We have another question that's come in about negotiations. So can you elaborate a little bit more on the difference between initial signing or following an agreement with a pro? Beth, maybe you could respond to that.
Yes. So in terms of negotiating with a pro, this is going to be an emerging process for Alberta that you'll need to be following. In terms of other jurisdictions, the approach has been providing standard offer agreements to communities that you'll have to review and determine whether you or not you can meet the terms and conditions, so that at which point you received the draft agreement from the pro, you would be, is what we're calling beginning the negotiation process. So you'll need to review and see if all those terms and conditions can be met based on what the standard offer is, standard agreement, and then identify any areas of the agreement that cause some concerns and figure out if there are points that could be negotiated.
Wonderful, thank you. We've had another question come in asking how many pros are there in Alberta, which has been answered. Thank you, Kim. There are currently 3 registered pros in Alberta at the moment. We have a follow-up question asking who the pros are and if they are assigned by areas, which I think will be answered momentarily. But we can move on to the second question from Michelle. Thank you for submitting. She writes, you mentioned that Frostview was going to keep status quo services until their current contract expired in 2027. Do you see that happening often? I was of the impression that all communities would have the same start date for the transition.
I'll defer to ARMA in terms to verify the start date of the transition. So yes, everybody is going to have the same similar start dates based on there are 2 phases of transition. What we're referring to here for Frostview is that they negotiated a contract term with the Pro to end in 2027. So it begins at transition and ends in November 2027 to coincide with the end of their current agreements that they have. So that would be something fairly common, is to figure out if you're going to be committing to providing services through an existing contract, what is that contract term, and figure out whether or not it's reasonable to continue that, or and that's an important consideration because your costs would change if you needed to re-tender that service or reissue a procurement for that service at a point during that that is at a point past the end of your agreement with the Pro. And you want to make sure that you have control of your costs and understand your costs. So you have to go with the known contracts that you have now.
Great, thank you, Beth. Appreciate that. Do we have any verbal questions? Anyone want to raise a hand and ask a question to our panel? No problem. If you keep that for the next question and answer period as well, we'll have a few more. We do have an answer. Oh, I think I have a hand. All right, I am going to allow you to ask your question now.
It's Len here with the Village of Hines Creek. Is that me you're talking to?
Yes.
Hey, my question, I typed it in there, but maybe I didn't see it. It was fairly short. So far, our discussions with Circular Materials indicate that they're only responsible for PPP and not HSP. And I'm just wondering, I understood they are the only ones registered in Alberta to handle this extended producer responsibility. And I'm just sure, I just would like clarification on who handles the HSP. It's not Circular Materials. Thanks.
Great question. Thank you. So looks like that. So yes, you are correct. Circular Materials does handle PPP, and the 2 other pros will handle HSBC, which is Call to Recycle and Product Care. And we had another follow-up question about who the pros are, which I've just mentioned, but the follow-up was, are they assigned by area? So all active and approved pros are listed on ARMA's website, or mentioned in the Q&A function. There's an answer there. And they are, I don't believe they are assigned by area, but I believe if you want any more information on that, you can go to ARMA's website or email them and they'll get you an answer on that. All right, any last questions before we keep going? We do have one more. One more question. I will go with the Q&A first. Regarding electronic products such as cell phones, how would we be handling that? I think that might be a question for ARMA, which you can certainly follow up with them on an email if you'd like more information on that. And then I see one more hand raised. I'm going to ask you to unmute.
Yes, it's Len again with the Village of Hines Creek. You mentioned, my question about who handles the HSB, and you had called to recycle, and I didn't catch the second one.
Product care.
Thank you.
No problem. And then I think I saw a hand up from a participant from Edmonton, but that has since gone down. I'll give you one last opportunity to ask your question if you'd like verbally. If not, we can move on. All right. Thank you so much for everyone's participation in this Q&A.
Okay, hi again. So I'll just run through a little bit more detail on the transition activities. So this portion of the webinar will explain what these transition activities will involve, and we'll pick on a few again, now and again, to give some examples. There are 9 planning and communication activities that I'll speak to today. The first one is developing an internal transition team to coordinate business plan and updates. Develop a responsibilities matrix, a staffing plan, a review of facilities and equipment, operations updates, bylaw update and enforcement plan, an update around performance measures, external communication plan, and a transition plan schedule. So those are not in any particular order, but this gives a range of activities that would be included in a transition plan. So the first one is an internal transition team. So the purpose of this is to get the right people together to coordinate internally around the transition. The purpose is also to exchange information across different business units within the community and to identify how the business unit should be positioned and prepared for the transition. So this could include, for example, finance staff, and that would be important because you could include them to talk about the impacts to revenues and expenses over different service areas. Someone from operations who might know, for example, the details around services for waste in parks or facilities, or someone who's very familiar with customer service operations. Contract management staff would be an important part too. So these are people who are responsible for contracts that would be impacted by the transition. And that might really help too when you're fleshing out your transition timelines, to have information from those internal staff that are managing contracts. Communication staff would be really important to have because some service descriptions and key messages could change. And customer service, of course, because there will be people interacting with the public or with your customers. And so that can help to inform the transition team in the planning and to get some feedback through customer service mechanisms after the transition started. So engaging the internal transition team early is a good way to start. It builds some strength in the organization and lets the community sort of work together to identify where concerns are, where budgetary impacts would lie, and to get that planning initiated. Our next activity is to do a responsibilities matrix. So this is a tool here, this chart, which you could customize. It's fairly simple in that the first column is your transition activities. So this is where once you've sort of developed some of your plan, you can list out the activities that you plan to do, and then assign someone who's responsible, accountable, identify who needs to be consulted and who needs to be informed. And this would be specific for your community based on your future state and based on the roles that people will play. You can customize it as you work through the planning processes. And just to point out that the responsible is sometimes hard to identify. What we mean by that is who's going to actually lead this work. So probably a manager of some sort that would spearhead that transition activity. And then accountability, what's meant by that is around who would sign off for that activity that's being done. Consulted is a little bit more self-explanatory. If you have a transition team, you'd probably have them consulted for many of the activities. You may also have a city solicitor that's consulted for various activities. And informed could be quite a broad range. And then how they're informed can go, we'll speak about that later when we're doing the communications planning activities. But this is a useful tool to identify in a snapshot who you need to reach out to. And this is also a working tool, so it can change over time, especially around who gets informed or consulted. So the first example I have is develop a transition plan. You'd probably have a manager that's responsible for waste planning in there. Maybe accountable would be a higher level, like a director. You'd be consulting the internal transition team, and you may want to inform fairly broadly around who needs to know the content of that transition plan. We could also have a transition activity here, such as updating scalehouse processes. And again, you'd probably identify a manager as responsible, maybe a director, someone involved in operations maybe is accountable. Maybe you'd consult with supervisors, and you'd need to inform the staff that were responsible for those processes. For updating a bylaw, you could go through that same process as well. And as I mentioned, you may need to consult with a city solicitor. Okay, so for staff planning, that's another transition activity. And this is important as the transition may require you to review all the staffing needs as things change. So there's some questions that you'd ask when creating a staffing plan, such as, are staffing levels appropriate now that the future state is being put in place? Is there increasing staff capacity for other program areas due to fewer EPR related responsibilities? So you look at how things would shift. Also, are there any unionized staff affected by the changes? And if so, then another activity that could go into your plan is to review collective agreements and consider the provisions that are in those collective agreements before thinking about how you move around or change duties of unionized staff. You also need to think about what processes are required to make changes to job descriptions and who would be involved in that. Maybe that involves human resources. Again, maybe it involves the union. And thinking too in your staffing plan about what training is required is important. So maybe new training needs to be developed. You need to identify who it needs to be provided to. So as I mentioned earlier, customer service is probably a big component of that. And there may be scripts that would change. And so those customer service staff would need to be provided with the new scripts and trained if there'd be maybe questions that come up with it. And then they would need to know how to direct callers, particularly if the community is not responsible for EPR services, direct callers appropriately. For example, if there's a miscollection, or just thinking through any of those processes in detail, and then that can get worked into the staffing plan. So the staffing plan, once that's put together, it can be used to create a communications plan. And that would be based on the changes to roles and responsibilities that are identified in the staffing plan. The internal communications plan would identify what staff need to know, what union leaders need to know, when they need to know it, and what the change will be. So how does this impact people, and what might their concerns be as this is changing? It could relate to changes in the service level, changes to business processes. There could be changes around the allocation of duties. So the staffing plan would communicate what needs to be communicated to affected people. Another area of activity is around facilities and equipment. So in the tool, there's a space where this has been identified, but it's important then to flesh that out in the transition plan. When considering the depot, transfer stations, and collection equipment, it's important to think about how the assets could be reallocated once that future state is known, and can they be used for other functions. And then also there's the financial and operational implications of those changes. So if we pick on Frostview and use that example, we noted in their current state that they use recycling carts. So a question here is, will the pros use the carts that have already been distributed to residents? And what's the value of these carts? So maybe each cart is not particularly valuable, but there are many of them and they've already been delivered out to people. So would the carts potentially be returned to Frostview? And what's the cost if that is the process that's used for the carts to be returned? If that's the plan, and if the pro will use their carts instead of Frostview continuing to use their carts, what's the cost for that to be recovered, and how do you work that into the agreement with the pro? It's important there that the carts don't become a stranded asset for the community. So then operations updates are another activity. This involves considering logistics and operations related to managing waste for IC&I facilities and public spaces. So this, again, was part of the transition tool that would have been laid out, but that information's being pulled out and being put into the plan, and that's a more specific view of how those operational processes need to change. In the Frostview example, data would be collected and analyzed to see how things have shifted over time. So the business processes that would be needed to get the right data would go into the transition plan. For the landfill, there'd also be potential changes to operations. So for example, would the Scalehouse software need to be reprogrammed, and would the operator information be updated? Will waste audits take place at the landfill? So any of those details around the activities that are currently being done can be filtered into the transition plan where they're appropriate. Same with the depots. So the transition plan considers potential changes for depot operations and asks, will the operations and materials change at the depots as well? Bylaw update and enforcement is another key activity. Again, this will apply differently depending on the scenario that has been selected. If the public has more, or the customers have more changes to the recycling program, there's a greater risk that recycling could end up in the garbage, and more of an emphasis on the enforcement would be required. If services are the same, then enforcement activities would not necessarily need to change to the same extent. So the bylaw updates are required to reflect the changes to the services that are being provided to the community. Bylaw enforcement will mitigate against potential customer confusion and set out the service level and the provision for collection. As I mentioned, there is a possible increase in illegal dumping if the services are changed. And there may need to be some coordination around this, particularly if different business units are involved in providing enforcement services. So that's something that might be included in the transition team as well, depending on how your community currently does this work. Potential mitigation strategies for enforcement could include cameras at depots or collections policies like leave behind protocols, or set out rules like perhaps if clear bags are used for garbage, that sort of thing can mitigate the potential for illegal dumping or poor diversion. We move on to the next activity. So performance monitoring is very important, and program performance can be measured through waste audits that can be done pre-transition and post-transition both. So this is important pre-transition to audit so that you have documentation around a baseline for diversion levels. And that could be completed, for example, a year before transition if you have been doing it, or depending on your transition date, you could start now potentially. For Frost View, audits would monitor the quantity and types of waste collected in garbage and recycling, because they're currently providing that, and they're currently providing to customers in single family, multi-family, IC&I, and depots. So those would be different opportunities to get a baseline of the current diversion levels. Having that data before the transition will be useful because then it can be used to compare after the transition. In post-transition audit, it's possible that the garbage stream is what you would focus on because you wouldn't be responsible for the EPR services. And that could be done perhaps a year after transition or starting more immediately. But the purpose of this is to compare against the pre-transition levels. Another purpose is to update projections for waste quantities if you have projections into the future and if you see that there are changes, potential changes to that forecast. As well, there's been quite a bit of discussion around metrics because waste diversion rate is used as a metric. And consideration could be given to maybe introducing a per capita waste generation metric rather than a diversion metric. Just because you may not have as much information about the EPR services further in the future. So it's just a conversation to think about how you want to measure your performance in the future once the future state is put in place. You can go to the next one. This is around external communications plan. So an external communication plan is required to communicate to outside customers, not within your organization. It's formed and reviewed by the internal transition team members. It identifies public-facing key messages for customers as identified in the current state. So in your current state, you will have identified who your customers are, and that becomes important then during this activity while you're identifying what they need to hear. The communications plan also identifies requirements for promotion and education. So that could be a website that you're updating, maybe a collections calendar, sorting tool. There may be games or other content that's been produced in prior years that may require an update as well. The external communication plan identifies the change that the customer will experience. For example, if recycling carts, as I mentioned earlier, are provided by the pro instead of the community, the communications plan might want to think about when and how that is communicated. It's also important to identify updates required at the site. So this could include maybe a sign at the entrance to a site or within a site, or signage, directional signage that leads people to the proper diversion areas. And it's important, as I mentioned, you will have identified your customers in the current state. It's important to think about how to do a communications that targets the customers in the right way as well. So you can think about the different kinds of tactics that can be used in the communications as well. We can continue to talk about the external communications plan. So it's important to consider a number of things in this plan. Like, what does each customer type need to know? When do the customers need to know it? What will the change be? And are the communications tactics appropriate for that change? So what is the potential impact? And what will their concerns be, if any? Who is responsible for the communications? And what are the internal processes required to put the communications plan in place? These are other things that can be laid out in your transition plan. So, for example, staff training is maybe done by someone different than the person who updates the promotion and education materials. And then lastly, it's also important to think about how the feedback from customers can be received and analyzed. And that can become part of your communications plan as well. If we go to the next slide, we can talk about external communication and tracking and monitoring, because this is an important aspect as well. I talked about tracking performance through waste audits, but here we can also think a little bit about tracking customer service. So the transition plan could include and outline a system for tracking and monitoring the quantity and the quality of customer service calls. And that can also happen both before and after the transition. So baseline data could be captured prior to the transition, so that then after the transition, you can evaluate any impacts of the transition. And our last activity in the transition plan is to develop a schedule. Now, I'm mentioning this one last, but in fact, this could be done fairly early in the process. The considerations when developing the transition schedule are the dependencies around the different transition activities. So it might be important to do one activity earlier than another. It's important to identify the fixed events, like contract end dates, and to know that early on in the process, so that you can do a work back and think about what else has to take place prior to that. Planning and implementation of the timelines in these transition activities is important. That would be set out in your schedule, as well as need for council decisions and the timing of when the approvals are. So again, there may be work back things to think through in this schedule. Using the tool will help to develop the schedule, because you'll see all the different types of activities that are coming out of the tool. It can be referred to frequently and updated as more information becomes available. The schedule is really a working document that you have in your back pocket to do planning as it's needed and as that information becomes clearer. It can be a really quick reference too on what needs to be done. And it's really, the best way to think of it is as a project management tool, because it does allow you to have an overview that you can see quite a bit of information at a time around the different activities and how they're going to impact and depend on one another. So we have a glimpse on the next slide of a transition schedule. And this will be provided as well following the webinar as an Excel spreadsheet. So it's a simple Gantt chart, really. You have your timelines. This particular one has 2 highlighted columns for phase 1 transition and phase 2 transition. You do not need to keep both, you need one, but you would shade that in to show sort of what you're working towards as the transition date. What I can do actually is share my screen and go through this a little bit more. So just bear with me for one moment. That should come up. Okay. So in this Gantt chart, we have a version date. And this is, again, important because this is a working document. It's something that more information will come to your attention at various times. You can give it a version number and a date. We have the years across the top and the quarters, and then the months. And the way I would use this is if we look at our legend right here, there's fixed events, planning periods, and implementation periods. So these planning periods, you can just copy and paste and then stretch it along for the duration of the event. So you may want to do it all in a month. You may want to do it over the course of several months. And you may find it works or it needs to change at some point. As well as the planning period, we have the implementation period. So there will be some activities that are that need to be thought through and planned, and then that will be implemented. So maybe you're putting it as green while you're identifying who's on your transition team, and then marking it as orange to say, okay, now this transition team is formed and active, and then it goes in for a longer period at that point. All of your activities can be down column B. And in this example, we have sub-activities and activities as well. You can add rows as you see fit and as is appropriate for your community. We have it set up with different phases. So the first is knowledge gathering and change management. So this is the preliminary stage around forming the team, developing the transition plan, preparing the financial analysis, developing the service agreements with the pros, and then some fixed events as well, like maybe you want to put the election in here or some engagements that you might have with counselors. So we have that knowledge gathering and change management. And then we have planning and developing the future state. So this is what we're calling phase 2. There's determining the future state and subcategories as well, which we've talked about a little bit earlier as well. And Beth, earlier in this webinar, talked about council as well. So then we have the operations, updates, and processes. And here you'd look to your tool as well. These are the, excuse me, the same categories where you'd think about public spaces, city facilities, landfill operations. This will be specific to your community, what you need to put in here. And again, it will just be copied over from the tool for what you found, because that's based on your current state. Amend the waste management bylaw. So maybe there's sub-steps within that as well, where you're drafting the bylaw revisions, developing an enforcement plan, and then having it received by council for approval. You could add further rows as you see fit. Maybe if you're doing this in conjunction with another bylaw or there's other things occurring in your community. Waste management master plan is something that we had for Frostview, so that's here as well. And there's some examples of what you would do potentially, or what Frostview would do here. Revising diversion financial forecast, the communications plan, pre-transition waste audits as well. So thinking about the frequency, or the timing of those audits. Service transition is on here as well. So this is as you're putting in your transition date would be marked either in one of the two highlighted places. Implementing your communications plan. So this is where you'd use more of the orange color and put down where things are getting implemented. You need to consider post-transition as well. So customer service and audits post-transition. And a diversion performance monitoring. So we have two tabs on here on the handout that we'll give you. One is just generic with some ideas that you can use to customize for your community. And then the FrostView example. So this is for you to use to refer back with an example of FrostView, just to see how it looks once it's filled out. And you can see the orange items sort of take place at the end there. So I'm going to stop sharing that. And I think we are having our deck back up. Okay. So I'll just close off before we take the questions that I believe there's more questions coming in. But I'll just close off with some other considerations, which is that when we're thinking of a community, and if we use our example of FrostView again, there may be alignments with other studies and planning activities. So we've given all these examples of planning activities that would go into the transition plan. There could be other ones in your community, but hypothetically, we're thinking that FrostView might have these ones, that they may want to align with strategic priorities and corporate policy, and that might become a section of the transition plan as well. Update goals and targets. So the diversion performance monitoring should be performed on an ongoing basis to track the achievement of targets. And that's in your, that's something that you would contemplate as well through your transition plan. And the results of those audits could inform your targets and goals overall. A forecast of waste quantities. So maybe there's other studies that would be useful to your community as a result of some of the tracking and monitoring that you're doing. And maybe a disposal option study would be required. Illegal dumping strategy, particularly if the service level changes. And household food and organic waste management program planning might also be something that you would mention and think through when you're doing the transition plan, particularly if you want to also think about when your community would do another study or how any kind of program planning would be aligned between your transition plan and any other sort of work that you have on an ongoing basis, as we did in our example of FrostView. So I do believe there are questions that are coming in. Thank you, Charlotte. I'll hand it to you.
Great, thank you so much for that, Kathy. Yes, we've had a couple of questions come into the chat or the question function. Again, feel free to raise your hand if you have a verbal question you'd like to ask. But we can kick it off with the first question, which is asking about if there's a checklist that has been created for communities to use when they're developing their program compensation costs to be used for negotiations with pros. So it would maybe look something like having a list of all operational functions, communication costs, signage costs, all that, so that nothing is missed during those negotiation periods, and they're better equipped to go into those negotiation times. So I'm not sure if Kathy or Beth has any idea about any of those types of checklists.
I think, unfortunately, the short answer is no. There isn't a quick checklist. And the reason for that, in our experience anyway, is that although community budgeting processes are quite similar, each community sets up their detailed financial systems and general ledger accounts in different ways. So the EPR tool itself and going through the process of identifying where the budget impacts are going to be helps you when you get into that detailed budget planning. So that's why you do need to do the financial analysis and comb through line by line in your budgets to figure out, based on what I see in the EPR tool, where is that in that budget line, and is there going to be some sort of ripple effect? So we did do a detailed financial analysis for a couple of communities, and that was the level of work that needs to be done. It's kind of budget process on steroids to really figure out making sure that the budgets that get tangled together. So I'll use an example of MRF operations. If their scale house is shared with another facility on the same site, how do you apportion costs? And if you made a budget change, what are the ripple effects? So there will be changes in your budget, and more so if, depending on the extent of the transition, a lot if you're fully handing over the responsibilities to the producers for those services.
Great, thank you. And I was wondering, to follow up on that, could you speak to what eligible and non-eligible costs are?
This is unfortunately a bit of uncertainty at the starting point, and this will, by going through the detailed financial analysis, helps you identify at least what you'll know what your costs are. Once you do that, when you get the offers from the pros on what they're prepared to pay for the services, that would outline specifically what eligible costs are and what aren't. So that will have to be something that comes as part of the process as more information comes from the pros for both the HSP and the recycling side of things.
Great, thank you. Another question has come in, just looking for examples about municipalities that operate EPR services at multiple transfer stations. There are a lot of moving parts and different operational costs at these sites. And a lot of the examples we've seen have been only recycling depots in towns. So I'm wondering if Kathy or Beth can speak to that a little bit.
Yes, we have one of the communities we worked with have 3 transfer stations and integrated recycling depots at those facilities. And the process that we ended up developing in conjunction with the staff is figuring out what portion of materials are related to the EPR related. So of the materials being handled at those facilities, what's the portion related to the EPR services, and identifying those specific costs. And that was helpful then to understand, could any cost be removed? And in the end, there was really just a per lift operating cost that was going to be a cost savings for the community, because they still had to operate the facilities for the other services. So that's a particular example of how we use the tool to figure out, yes, there's going to be changes to those facilities and the operations, and then using that information to search out specific general ledger accounts in their operating budget and understanding where those fixed costs are for their operations and what are the variable ones associated with the EPR materials.
Great, thank you. And I know you were speaking about eligible and ineligible costs being a bit uncertain at this time, but I was wondering if you had any insight into the extent of which capital costs specifically related to the management of PPP will be compensated.
This is a gray area, and so it's something that we've been working with the communities we worked with. They went through processes to identify their capital costs associated with the EPR materials and what the value of those assets were. None of the communities that we had worked with decided to continue on using their facilities. So one of them went through a process to ask for proposals or expressions of interest to figure out what might be done with the, in this case, a materials recycling facility. So it is unique to your community and also somewhat geographically unique in terms of what the producers, particularly for the printed paper and packaging, what kind of processing facilities might be needed, and that might be where some negotiations come in. So unfortunately, no cookie cutters there, but going through that detailed financial analysis helps you identify those costs.
Great, thank you. We've had one more question. I just want to open it up to our attendees to see if anyone has a question, wants to raise a hand. Okay, Michelle, I'm going to unmute you now. Perfect, you should be able to ask your question.
Thanks so much. I asked this at the last webinar, and I was just wondering if we could get maybe a little bit of an overview of what it would look like for a community that decided to deregister from the program. I guess the level of work to transition as well as the cost benefit for it may not be, I guess, feasible for some of the smaller communities. And just wondering what that would look like if we decided to not participate in this program. Thank you.
And I think, Michelle, if I'm understanding it correctly, if you went through this process and decided in the end that you wanted to deregister, that it wasn't viable, I would defer to ARMA on specific processes that would need to be followed to make sure that you understand what the possibilities are there.
Okay, thank you. It was specific to if we would be in default of any legislation requirements or anything like that, if that's at all helpful to the ARMA representatives. I know there are a few communities that are talking about whether or not to continue on this line or to deregister. Thank you.
Sure, and I can speak to this for a moment if that's all right. And so in Alberta, it is optional for communities to participate in the EPR program. And so communities who are not interested in participating certainly have that option. And as our presenters mentioned, if this is something that you want to discuss, simply just give the EPR team a call. We can walk you through what that looks like. It's a simple process, so even if you have registered, you simply call us and we'll have a talk with you about that and go through the process. And then at a later date, if you're interested in participating after seeing what it looks like in other communities, you certainly can. So happy to have a call with you and talk about this more. So please just connect with us offline and we'd be happy to talk with you more about this. Michelle.
Perfect. Thanks very much.
And I think that type of question is a great one, that this process helps your community go through to understand what the implications are and where you want to go with that. And ultimately, with the EPR legislation, your community isn't responsible for those materials any longer. So it's that decision process and using the EPR tool and transition planning that helps you make those decisions.
Great. Thank you, Beth. We have another hand raised, so I'm going to unmute you. You should be able to ask your question. Go ahead.
Thank you. It's Len from the Village of Hinds Creek. Yeah. There's some not confusion, but it's a lot to take in, even with the great presentations you've done, especially giving the various sizes of communities from big cities to small villages. Is there an opportunity for us to get in contact with some of the types of communities that are very similar to our own that have successfully undergone a negotiation with the pros and in other provinces or whatever, that we could have a chat with to just sort of demystify the whole process?
I think so. Yes, reaching out to your municipal colleagues in other provinces, I think, would be the starting point right now. And if you wanted to pose that question to ARMA and give them a little bit more detail on the size of your community, we certainly could help to match you up with the community that we're aware of in Ontario or BC. Those are the two provinces that are BC has led the pack in this process, and Ontario, there are waves of communities that are in the process of transition. So I think that would be helpful if we could get an idea of your size through ARMA and try and match you up, and certainly use any municipal networks that you have in the province to make those connections. I know that from my days in municipal government, always eager to help out colleagues from other jurisdictions who are planning their transitions. And you're right, it really demystifies the process and gives them lessons learned too on things tips and tricks that your colleagues have learned in terms of navigating the whole process.
Thank you
Yeah,
very
and
much.
I'll just jump in here. That's such a great question. So we definitely want to hear from you. So if you don't mind just sending a quick email over to us at ARMA, that would be great. This is exactly the type of feedback that we're looking for from communities, because we really want to make sure that you're supported. And so I think you've brought up a really great idea. So if you don't mind just sending me an email, that would be great. And then we can connect with you offline. Thanks again.
Okay, thank you.
Amazing. We have a couple more minutes for questions. If anyone does have any more questions they'd like to ask. And again, if you can't think of any now, as Gabby said, you can email them and they will certainly answer your questions.
And just a reminder that all of the workshops and the resources that we've provided through these 3 workshops are all available on the ARMA website. And so that's just wanted to let you know that that'll be there, and that the information from today's workshop will be posted tomorrow.
Great, thank you. Well, we haven't got any more raised hands, so I will pass it back to Kayla to close up the workshop.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you so much. This was a really great conversation today. So on behalf of ARMA and our presenters, I just want to thank you so much for your participation. As mentioned, the recording from this session will be available later this week on the ARMA website for those who want to revisit the conversation and just review what was mentioned here today. For additional EPR information, the ARMA website is a great resource. And as mentioned a few times, you can connect right with the ARMA team directly at the email here on the screen. They're available to answer the questions that you have. Thanks again for joining us today. I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your week and a great long weekend. Thanks so much. Bye.